الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله وسلم عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بالإحسان إلى يوم القيامة. يقول الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. أما بعد فإن خير الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. My subject today is called Learning from History. And I'm going to give context as to what I mean by that exactly. For any of us who are familiar with the very popular show Resurrection Earth, right? So it's basically like the halal version of Game of Thrones, right? This particular show, it shows the origins of what we know as the Ottoman Empire. And it gives you a window into appreciation as to what was going on in that time period of human history, and the history of the Muslims, the history of the Muslim world at that time, relative to the revelation of the Quran. And it should force us to appreciate the groundwork that certain people have done so that Al-Islam can be carried throughout the rest of the world as it has been today. The Ottoman Empire sprung up out of a period of great religio-political chaos within the Muslim world. The Muslim world at this time, the prior period was the Abbasi period, in which there was a lot of tumultuous situations going on. The Muslim world at that time was being attacked viciously on two fronts. The Eastern Front, it was being attacked by the Mongol invasion of Central Asia, in which the Mongol forces, prior to some of them adopting al-Islam, they swept across Central Asia and they basically ransacked half of the Muslim world, including the sacking of Baghdad. And on the Western Front, you had the Judeo-Christian Crusaders, who originally began their crusade campaigns within Europe, attacking and killing other Christians, and then they swept across Europe, and then they ended up in the Middle East, massacring Muslims, Jews, and Christians in the Middle East. So these were the two major religio-political conflicts that existed in the Muslim world at that time. So once the Abbasi period, the Abbasi Empire fell, the Muslim world was in much disarray politically, and in terms of unification, the Muslims were broken apart significantly. So here swings in the Ottoman Empire, giving some type of hope in terms of religio unification. Like, for example, when Allah says in the Quran, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Allah says, and cling to the rope of Allah together and do not separate. So the Ottoman Empire was trying to collect what was left of the Muslim world and give it some type of religio-political unison and unity. This is very significant by virtue of the fact that this year marks a centennial, a 100th anniversary of the non-existence of al-Khilafah, Islamic governance. It's been 100 years since the Muslim world has had a global government governing the affairs of the Muslims, or governing the affairs of the majority of the Muslims. Because obviously, as we know, as al-Islam spread relative to the revelation of the Quran, it spread to different places that were external of the realm of the Khilafah. We know this. This is why there are millions of Muslims in Indonesia, China, even here in the Americas, so on and so forth. But specifically to this part of the world, for a long time there was a lot of religio-political unison and unity among Muslims, and then certain things happened, like the things that I aforementioned, that caused the disunity of the Muslims religio-politically. So this is why the Ottoman Empire became so vital in terms of trying to recollect and bring back some type of religio-political unification among the Muslims. And the Ottoman Empire lasted 642 years, from 1280 CE to 1922 CE, which was literally 100 years ago. And again, prior to the establishment of the Ottoman Empire, many of the dislocations, many of the atrocities that affect the Muslims today, those same exact things, those similar things existed back then. You had non-Muslim world powers, non-Muslim global powers at the time, literally feasting on the Muslims and committing theft, rape, and murder upon the Muslims, imposing theft, rape, and murder upon the Muslims, much like today. And when we look back at history, there's a very famous idiom, there's a very famous a statement, which states that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And unfortunately, we have not learned from our history. We have been repeating these things that have occurred in the history of Muslims. And Einstein made a very interesting statement. He said, insanity is constantly doing the same things over again, expecting different results. So for those of us who are Muslims, we keep doing the same thing over and over again. We keep disuniting, we keep fragmenting, and then we expect external forces to not oppress us. It's like, how can we expect external forces to not oppress us when we oppress each other? I'll give you an example. one of the key reasons how and why the Ottoman Empire fell was because of al-asabiyya, xenophobia. People hating one another based on things that we have no control over, like language, like skin complexion, like regional origin, right? So you have the Muslims of the Middle East, they literally helped non-Muslim world powers fight against al-Khilafah, fight against Islamic governance. And because of their contribution to the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, those same exact things that occurred historically prior to the Ottoman Empire, they exist now in our world in a much more drastic way, in a much worse way. And it's really pathetic and it's really sad that we look at history and we just turn a blind eye as though, oh, that was just for yesteryear, it doesn't apply now. No, it always applies, because again, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And in context, this is very important because we see all of the dislocations, we see the conflicts in the Muslim world just globally, but more specifically within Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries. We see all of these types of oppression that us as Muslims we've imposed upon one another, and that we have also assisted non-Muslims to impose those things upon Muslims as well. For example, the U.S.-led invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, for example. Those three theaters of wars or proxy wars or whatever you want to call them. Every single one of those conflicts, you had Muslim countries helping U.S. coalition forces invade and occupy Muslim countries. For example, when the U.S. invaded Somalia in the 90s, Pakistan and Malaysia assisted the U.S. coalition forces to invade and occupy Somalia. During the whole quote-unquote war on terror theater, where the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, which till this day is the longest standing U.S. military conflict in U.S. history. We had Muslim countries help the United States invade Afghanistan. We had Muslim countries who helped the United States invade Iraq. And in fact, there was a former U.S. envoy who literally said out of his own mouth, word for word, he said, had it not been for our Arab allies in the region, the invasion of Iraq would have never been successful. A former U.S. envoy literally said this in an interview, live, word for word. And again, this is no different than the Muslims helping the Allied powers during World War I fight against the Ottoman Empire. It's literally a cycle. It's a toxic cycle. Just like an abusive cycle. We witness abuse, we live through abuse, and instead of ending the cycle, we continue the cycle. And that is something that is wrong within us. And it's something that we, as individuals, and demographically as Muslims, we have to really introspect and we have to learn how to change this. Because just like when Allah says in chapter 13, verse 11, Allah says, verily Allah does not change what's within any people until they change what is within themselves. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. إن الحمد لله رب العالمين وكفى والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم المصطفى وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه لا إله إلا الله. The second part of my khutbah is actually dedicated to a non-Muslim who I had a conversation with, and I'm part of this leadership fellowship of different Muslim and non-Muslim. It's a religious entity that it galvanizes Muslims and non-Muslims to work together in terms of shared common interests, in terms of getting resources from communities and cooperation between different religious faith groups. So it's one particular person. She is a Hindu activist, and she was very vocal, and she stands on a platform to be very vocal against what is known as Hindutva, in India, the Indian subcontinent. Hindutva is an organization that has existed since the 1920s. If I'm not mistaken, they started in 1923, which ironically is the same year that the term Islamophobia was first coined. So in the manifesto, in the Risala, if you will, in the Risala, the manifesto of Hindutva, they praise people like Franco, the fascist dictator of Spain. They praise people like Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. They praise people like Adolf Hitler, the Nazi dictator of Nazi Germany. And there's a lot of correlation between Hindutva and fascism and Nazism, because one of the hallmarks of the Aqidah, the theology of Nazism, is that the Nazis have this belief, even people who are neo-Nazis to this day, they have this belief that they are the quote-unquote descendants of ancient Aryans who migrated from what is now the Indian subcontinent across Central Asia, across the Middle East, and across through Europe. Now, even though it's true that some ancient Aryans, not all of them, even though it's true that they did migrate across these different regional locations in the world, this is why the Indo-European language group is the largest language group in human history. Even though it's true that these Aryans migrated to where they did, there's no way to prove that these people who claim to be of a quote-unquote superior Aryan race are the descendants of these people in the subcontinent. Which is really ironic because the Aryans are not European. So that shows you the hypocritical irony of their theology. But anyway, there's a lot of correlation between Hindutva and Nazism, fascism. The term itself, Hindutva, basically means Hinduism or nothing. Hindutva itself as an entity was classified as a right-wing, pro-Hindu, anti-non-Hindu entity that's very powerful in the Indian subcontinent, India proper specifically. Hindutva is basically the combination of what we in the United States would know as the KKK, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Skinheads, the Oath Keepers, and the Proud Boys combined. That's basically Hindutva, all of these different groups combined. That's what Hindutva is. And they've amassed a lot of power and influence in the Indian government. They're completely, fully entrenched in all dimensions and all facets of the Indian government. Even the current Prime Minister now, Modi, it's a known fact that, and this is what this person who's an anti-Hindutva activist, this Hindu person that I spoke to, that I aforementioned, that I already spoke about, this person disclosed the fact that Modi has been part of Hindutva since they were 8 years old. So they literally were raised by this group, by this hate group, Hindutva. And again, like I said, Hindutva is very, very powerful in India. And they have continuously been enacting religio-political policies in India that ironically even contradicts the secular charter of the Indian Constitution. And they are very forthright to eliminate Muslims from India. And not just Muslims, other non-Hindus generally, but specifically Muslims. They have a very particular, a very specific hatred against Muslims. Now, for us as Muslims, what do we learn from that? Number one, what Allah says in chapter 5, verse 8. Allah says, and never let your hatred against any people prevent you from behaving justly. Even for us as Muslims, even if we hate someone, we are never Islamically justified or entitled to oppress someone just because we hate them. And for us as Muslims, when we look at hate, just reflecting upon that ayah, that verse, the first thing that should come to our mind is that, okay, even if I hate someone, even if I have a hatred against someone, I still have to respect them as a human being, as a creation of Allah. And then when we have that mindset, we force ourselves to think, why is it exactly do I even hate this person? And when we allow ourselves to reflect upon that, we'll find out that probably 9 out of 10, the reasons how and why we hate someone is not even Islamically justified. It's not even Islamically valid. But that's just a side point of what I want to mention in terms of the price that we as Muslims pay for al-iftiraq, for division. This is literally the reason how and why Allah commands us. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. This is how and why Allah commands us to not be divided. This is how and why Allah commands us to cling to the rope of Allah together and to not be divided. This is a command for us religiously in terms of our bonds, our religious spiritual bonds as Muslims. This also applies to a religio-political context. So not only is Allah commanding us to be religio-spiritually united, He also commands us to be religio-politically united. So let us learn from our history and let us be the people who turn the tide and reverse repeating negative history. And if you don't know anything about the Ottoman Empire specifically, I suggest that you do some research about it. And because it's like all of the Khilafah periods are important, but specifically the Ottoman Empire, because it was the last one, that's something that we should study specifically, because it's the most recent one that we had, and it's the last one that we've had to date. So even though the Prophet he said that the Khilafah is going to be restored before the arrival of the Mahdi, the guided one who preceded Isa, even though the Prophet mentioned that Islamic governance will be reestablished, we have to decide for ourselves as Muslims, are we going to work towards that, or are we going to work against it? Are we going to still be of those who help non-Muslims fight against fellow Muslims? Or even us ourselves, are we going to contribute to the oppression of another Muslim? The oppression against fellow Muslims? Because it's something very important that Muhammad, peace be upon him, said. He said there's only 3 justifications to harm any Muslim. Not even just kill, but just to harm, period. There's only 3 justifications to harm another Muslim. A sexual offense that requires the death penalty, murder, betrayal against the Muslims, which is an act of apostasy. This narration is recorded, one of the places that this narration is recorded is Al-Arba'in al-Nawawiyya, the 40 Hadith collection of Imam al-Nawawi. So we ask Allah to make us of those who learn from history. We ask Allah to make us of those who do not oppress. We ask Allah to protect us from oppressing ourselves and oppressing other people. We ask Allah to make us different from those who oppress people just because they are different from them. We ask Allah to make us of those who do not oppress people just because they are not Muslim. We ask Allah to protect us from oppressing fellow Muslims. We ask Allah to make us of people who are upright and who contribute positively to our world. And we ask Allah to protect us from being of those who cause more damage than good. وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أقيموا الصلاة إن الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
استووا اعتدلوا استووا. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. إن الإنسان خلق هلوعا إذا مسه الشر جزوعا وإذا مسه الخير منوعا إلا المصلين الذين هم على صلاتهم دائمون والذين في أموالهم حق معلوم للسائل والمحروم والذين يصدقون بيوم الدين والذين هم من عذاب ربهم مشفقون إن عذاب ربهم غير مأمون. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. والذين هم من عذاب ربهم مشفقون إن عذاب ربهم غير مأمون والذين هم لفروجهم حافظون إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم فإنهم غير ملومين فمن ابتغى وراء ذلك فأولئك هم العادون والذين هم لأماناتهم وعهدهم راعون والذين هم بشهاداتهم قائمون والذين هم على صلاتهم يحافظون أولئك في جنات مكرمون فما للذين كفروا قبلك مهطعين عن اليمين وعن الشمال عزين أيطمع كل امرئ منهم أن جنة نعيم كلا إنا خلقناهم مما يعلمون فلا أقسم برب المشارق والمغارب إنا لقادرون على أن نبدل خيرا منهم وما نحن بمسبوقين فذرهم يخوضوا ويلعبوا حتى يلاقوا يومهم الذي يوعدون يوم يخرجون من الأجداث سراعا كأنهم إلى نصب يوفضون خاشعة أبصارهم ترهقهم ذلة ذلك اليوم الذي كانوا يوعدون الله سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله إن شاء الله ننتظر معنا صلاة العصر إن شاء الله سنؤذن بعد صلاة الجمعة بإذن الله تعالى.